Hi everyone, my name is Yinka Fabusuyi. Welcome to our presentation on equity, diversity and inclusion and how to develop ways in which you can make your educational institutions more equitable, diverse and inclusive. I am a senior teaching fellow at the University College of Osteopathy and have been a clinical educator at the University College of Osteopathy.
Hi everyone, my name is Draper-Rodi. I'm the Director of the National Council for Osteopathic Research in the UK, and I'm the Head of Research and Knowledge Exchange at the University College of Osteopathy. I'm delighted today to present to you our findings from the urgent study that we will be discussing later on, and also to discuss some concepts which are important for us to be aware of when we start to look at how we can make a more inclusive environment for our students in our institutions. So let's start with our declaration of interest. Both Yinka and myself are independent clinicians with interest in promoting osteopathy to provide care for patients. We are both fellows, as senior teaching fellow or associate professor at the UCO, with interest in promoting research and evidence-informed practice. We have received funds for conducting research in equity, diversity, and inclusion in undergraduate training from the Osteopathic Foundation, from the UCO, the Institute of Osteopathy, and the General Osteopathic Council. We also receive income from providing CPD at the UCO in equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we also have interest in promoting research, me as director of NCORE, and I'm also a fellow of the SOLAR program, which is the Strengthening Osteopathic Leadership and Research program, which is at the UTS in Sydney.
So our learning objectives for today are to help you begin to understand the experiences of people from underrepresented groups in their encounters with educational settings. So that could be students, staff and patients. And to start you on the journey to accessing tools that will help you with your widening appeal to students and faculty from all demographics.
So, is our society fair? We can look generally about our society and more specifically in the UK. We know that there is a pay gap that is quite important if we look at the difference of how much women and men are paid for similar roles. Also, we know that depending on our ethnic background and also skin color, we are likely to be receiving different treatment from different institutions in our society. Despite being the sixth largest economy in the world in the UK, we still have a large portion of our in our community who need to have food parcels to be able to live and to feed themselves. Depending on our beliefs and religion, we're also going to be likely to be facing discrimination if we are part of a religious group which is underrepresented in our society. And finally, depending on how able or if we have a disability, we are likely to have we are likely to be treated differently and to face discrimination on a regular basis. If we look in healthcare and even beyond, this is something that is also quite common. So we can see on the left-hand side that there is institutional racism that exists in the UK in healthcare. And if we then look at the another report that was conducted, this report found that there was no evidence of institutional racism. So whilst we're not maybe here to discuss which one is true, we can see that there is probably some sort of discrepancy in how maybe these issues are being looked at and being assessed and then being reported. A report that was done a few years ago looked at the experience of students who identify as LGBTQIA+, and what was their experience as students in UK universities. And the report demonstrated that the experience was extremely poor, with report of how the students were treated differently because of their sexual identity. The NHS employers have responded to the sexual harassment report of female surgeons, which has been quite a big topic this year. And also nurses have been making clear statement about sexual harassment and the fact that that had to change. So we can see that there is a common thread that is coming from different groups regarding discrimination, bullying, harassment that is ongoing in healthcare. This topic goes beyond healthcare, obviously, and this is just one example out of so many where McDonald's face up to 2 sex abuse claims a week. And these are, as you can see from the dates, quite recent to when this webinar was recorded. So, first of all, what I would like to say clearly, this is not about individuals. So if you are listening or to this recording, first of all, thank you very much. But also, this is not to blame or shame anyone. This is not about finger pointing. This is not about specific staff in osteopathic educational institutions. This is really about institutional problems that we are trying to tackle and to look at potential answers for us to move forward. So the URGENT project, URGENT standing for Underrepresented Groups Experiences in Osteopathic Training, was a 2-year project that was conducted across the UK with a large team. And the first phase of that project was to do a systematic review that was looking at the existing evidence for osteopathy, but also chiropractic and physiotherapy, looking at harassment, bullying, and discrimination. The findings were published in the International Journal of Educational Research Open, and the QR code on the right-hand side will take you directly to the manuscript, which is in open access. So the definitions we used in this review was for discrimination, abuse or humiliation in which people are treated differently according to their personal characteristics. Bullying were patterns of negative behavior by groups or individuals which harm and victimize. And harassments were behaviors that are perceived to be abusive, humiliating, or hostile. So we found 400 records in the different databases that we searched, out of which 17 articles were included. 16 were from physiotherapy, 14 in the UK, 1 in Norway, 1 in Nigeria, 1 from chiropractic in Sweden, and none were found in osteopathy. A quarter of the students in the UK in physiotherapy reported experiencing bullying, and all of the students in the Nigerian context also reported bullying. We have to notice that in the UK, that was just from one institution and the sample was quite small. They reported that it was very likely that there was some underreporting, so the true extent of bullying is still largely unknown. 2/3 of the incidents of bullying were from a member of staff to a student, which led to the fact that it was potentially underreported because of the lack of retaliation. And the behaviors that were reported range from unsupportive behavior to overt sexual harassment or aggression. There was an attainment gap and higher attrition rates, which was 7 times higher for students who had experienced discrimination. And the attainment gaps and higher attrition rates were found for students from Black and minority ethnic groups, and also from students with disabilities in the UK within the physiotherapy profession. It was a cis heteronormative culture, and that was often masked in humor, but there was a lack of data for students' experience who identified as LGBTQIA+. and there were sexual harassment and also a culture of gender discrimination. And female students took actions to try to desexualize their appearance during training. So the conclusions of our review was that there was widespread discrimination, harassment and bullying within manual therapy education, and there was a clear need for further research to focus upon the intersection of characteristics identified as being linked to these experiences, but there was no existing data in osteopathy. So the follow-up for us was to do a mixed method study where we did a survey of all students in the UK, followed by a series of focus groups and workshops that I'm going to present very briefly here. But if you want further information, it is available on a dedicated project page, which is on uco.ac.uk/urgent, where you will have access to a series of lectures and PowerPoints that were conducted during a forum day in April 2023. So I'm going to briefly summarize what came from the discussion of the different focus groups we had with the students. And I do apologize because it's quite a busy slide, but basically what came up from the discussion with the students is that they noticed institutional structural barriers that were related to the faculty's lack of awareness and knowledge, also their peers that could have comments which were sexist or that were homophobic. And another topic that came up was silent discrimination, when students were not raising their voice when, for example, faculty members were making comments which were racist, sexist, or ableist. By not raising these concerns, they were not supporting the students who were from underrepresented groups. Another institutional structural barrier was the lack of representation in the patients, students, but within the curriculum. And the process to complain was quite unclear. Some of these aspects will be discussed during the rest of the discussion, the rest of the webinar, and also we will be discussing that during the workshop organized by GOSC in spring 24. The second theme on the right-hand side of the screen was the conceptual understanding that students from underrepresented groups had. Their definition of discrimination was maybe not really completely aligned with the definition often considered, and they thought that discrimination was related to the intention of the person. So if the person was making a discriminatory comment with no intention to hurt or to discriminate, that would not be considered discrimination. When discrimination is not about intent, but more about the consequence. And that's why for the project, we use the word as being othered or othering, which we will discuss later, because that was something that was more meaningful to the students. Another aspect was that these students' conceptual understanding was better than their peers or than the faculties in their osteopathic educational institutions, which pushed themselves to learn by oneself, and also they had to teach the other students or the faculty members. Following this project, we then did a forum day where all stakeholders were invited, which included faculty members of the different osteopathic education institutions in the UK, but also student representatives and representatives from other professions, including in chiropractic, physiotherapy. We had representative from the NHS, from higher health education in England, and also from GOSC, the IO, the Osteopathic Foundation, and from other osteopathic stakeholders. We ran a series of workshops, and following these 3 workshops that were done several times so that all participants could attend all of them, we looked at the themes that emerged from these workshops, and we tried to organize them to try to start looking at what would be required for osteopathic educations to become more inclusive. The main topic that came up was the one on the top left, training provision. And that training provision was seen as crucial for all people involved in an OEI, including the staff, but also the students and the institution itself, to be able to overcome some of the current obstacles that exist for students from underrepresented groups to have a similar experience to other students. And there were other aspects that were discussed regarding creating access to student and staff for to experience to provide support to other students, an increase of staff awareness of EDI concepts and also things that could be done differently. Regarding students, on the top right hand side, supporting students, increasing the student support was important. Building communities and peer-to-peer relationships was important for students from underrepresented groups. Promoting student-led initiatives, promoting inclusion for potential students pre-enrollment, and enhancing and developing student unions. For staff within the institution, we had increase of inclusivity in the curriculum, and that was something that we've already discussed about the lack of representation in the curriculum. Mentoring, peer support, enhancing the curriculum and teaching and learning, and promoting role modeling and diversity in the faculty. Regarding the institution itself, providing, working towards having more representation in the institution from diverse groups, improving the processes for equity, diversity, and inclusion, promoting activities to support participation and awareness of diversity, and finally, enhancing the collection of data for enhancing inclusion. And that is that may be some of the themes and topics that we will be discussing during the workshop at USC in early 2024.
So in working with students, we very much want to take a person-centered approach, a whole person approach, which will mean that we should have some awareness of the idea of background and cultural identity, particularly as it might be very different from our own or our own experiences. So when we look at background, we're thinking about the sort of family someone may have come from, their racial origins, the education they may have had, the types of work experience they have, their financial status perhaps. And when we're thinking about cultural identity, we're very much thinking about the sort of foods they might eat, the social behaviours in their culture, the art that they might be interested in or have grown up with or looked at consume, literature, language, religion, and all these things might be very different from our own experience, but they will very much be what people are bringing into the lecture room, into the treatment room. And so having an awareness of those things, as I've said, particularly as they may be different from our own, can really enrich the experience and support students' learning.
So some words we often hear about are power, privilege, and these are probably sometimes loaded with an understanding which is a little bit different from what is hopefully conveyed. So I thought it would be easier, it would be useful maybe just to provide a little bit of context of what these words might mean, or what is the meaning we have when using these words. Power is the ability to influence and make decisions that impact others. Privilege is a form of societal power. And social justice is the practice of allyship and coalition work in order to promote equality, equity, respect, and the assurance of rights within and between communities and social groups. In the next slide, we're going to see how power, privilege is impacting social justice. So I would like to present to you the coin model of privilege and critical allyship that was developed by Nixon a few years ago. And in the middle, you can see in light yellow a coin. On the side of the coin, you have the system of inequality on which currently our society is organized. On the top of the coin, you have people who have privilege, and these are people who have advantage that others do not have, and they did not earn that advantage or that privilege. They have it because of who they happen to be. On the lower part of the coin, this is where oppression happens. And this is where people have disadvantage that others don't have. They didn't do anything to earn that oppression, and they have it because of who they happen to be. And that is due to the social structure on which our society is built that produces and maintains inequality. And that could be related to sexism, racism, ableism, homophobia. And in our society or in our life, obviously, there are many aspects of our life where on some aspects which we might have some form of power, for example, because one might be white, and we might be oppressed because of our sexuality, if someone was LGBTQIA+. So we can see that it's obviously a system which is much more complex than a two-sided coin, because we all have probably multiple coins in our own pocket that is going to define how much power and privilege we have and in which context. And that is what is usually understood in the concept of intersectionality. So this is one out of so many different definitions, but intersectionality is a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves and create obstacles that often are not understood among conventional ways of thinking.
So here we have a case presentation. We have a student who is seeing a patient, and the patient has brought with them a family member who is going to act as an interpreter. And the student notices that the interpreter is not really relaying the student's questions. And the students brought this to you. So what suggestions could you make to allow them to get the most from the encounter, which has clearly become a little bit awkward and difficult? So some things that we could suggest are good practice that you could encourage your student to do is to use good communication, use of good non-verbal communication, so good eye contact, because there is a temptation when we're nervous to sort of start to avoid eye contact. To start to encourage the student to address their questions to the patient. So although the interpreter is the interface, to address the questions to the patient so that they know that they are actively involved in the consultation. Taking the time to explain to the interpreter again what their role is, what the student's expectations are of the interpreter in that consultation. The student could be encouraged to moderate their speech in some way and reflect on their speech, in all sorts of ways, volume, speed, that kind of thing. and encouraging the student to be comfortable seeking clarification, stopping the encounter, reframing it in some way. Things that perhaps aren't ideal or less than good practice. There is a temptation to turn it into a two-way conversation, to almost cut the patient out, even though they're the active participant, but to sort of just go with the interpreter and assume that the interpreter's got the whole picture and knows what's going on, particularly because they're a family member. Just to ignore the fact that there's a problem. The student may have noticed this, but they are tempted to just ignore it because it's just easier to do that and they can get through it, which leads to the next part of less good practice, in that you just rush through it just to get through it so they can get it done and be done with it. And then to encourage them to look at the seating arrangement, so that the patient feels empowered. It could be that the positioning of the seating puts the interpreter at the forefront of things, when actually, although the interpreters are very important, very important part of it, that actually they are dominating it. So to look at the seating arrangement and to encourage students to do that before the encounter begins, so that they will have sort of almost pre-reflected on the situation, which is part of the learning experience. So when we're working with students who are working with people whose gender may be different from their sex at birth, mistakes can be made. We can get it wrong, and it's okay, we're suggesting, to get it wrong, because learning can come from that, and we can learn from our patients and from our students, actually. And it's okay to ask if we're not sure. There has to be an awareness and an empathy and compassion, but we can ask. And as we all know, patients can be really just fantastic for our learning, and every encounter can be a learning experience. And it can be difficult for some generations to grasp these concepts when we're working with trans or non-binary people, and that has sometimes been called the grey line, and that we do need to be kind, but we also need to be supportive and educational in our approach, open and educational in our approach. But I don't think we can move forward unless we have this understanding that sometimes we get it wrong, that that's okay, and that it is all right to ask. So coming to definitions of sex, the next slide will be gender. So the World Health Organization's describing sex as that which pertains to biological and physiological characteristics. So things that are associated with the male and female reproductive organs that people are born with, and the hormones that we excrete, and our chromosomal makeup. And when we think about how we're talking to patients, how we're supporting students to talk to patients about the reproductive system, bearing this in mind is very important, because you will be working with, or your students will be working with, people whose sex does not align with their gender. So you may be talking to somebody who is describing themselves as male, who identifies as male, but who happens to have a female reproductive system. And we know, for the statistics are telling us that trans people have a less positive experience, less positive outcomes in healthcare than their cis counterparts. And by cis, I mean somebody who whose gender aligns with their biological sex. So we need to have sensitivity around this, we need to have an awareness around this, so that we don't add to the woes of that particular individual, and that we can support them in ways that osteopathic care can, with the signposting that we might suggest, with the care that we offer. Gender. A set of socially constructed characteristics of men and women that divide men and women into having different norms and roles and relationships. It can be changed, varies from society to society. But when people don't fit into a gender norm, they can often face discrimination, stigmatization, social exclusion. And so when we come to think about our information gathering forms, our case history forms, if we're sensitive about this, and we know that there can be people who have changed their gender, can have faced discrimination, we need to encourage allowing someone to describe the pronouns or the preferred names that they want to work with. So we might be asking questions like sex assigned at birth, their legal sex, and their gender, not making assumptions, and encouraging sensitive and appropriate curiosity around that. Going back to what I said about sometimes we get it wrong, and that's okay, and we're learning and supporting our students and our patients. So when we look at microaggressions and ethnic minorities, in this example or in this slide, we're looking at instances where people have been slighted or made to feel less than, or been, I would describe it as almost been forced into a corner. So in this particular example, we have a broadcaster, TV presenter, journalist, Fiona Bruce, who was presenting a program, was calling people from the audience to put their questions, and had called a number of people from the audience to put their questions, who in this context, it's important to say, were white. And they were called on the basis of the clothing they were wearing. So the man in the green shirt, the woman in the pink scarf. And when a black person in the audience indicated they wanted to ask a question, they were called forward on the black man in the audience. And this created, there were complaints made, this created a stink. It has to be said that Fiona Bruce did apologise, and the broadcaster pulled that particular part of the recording. But it's just a moment where, again, an opportunity to use the same, let's say, identifier could have been used and wasn't. That person was made to feel not pleasant, and it created an unnecessary moment that could have been avoided. So when we're working in these ways, it's important to think about equity. It's important to think about microaggressions. It's important to think that as educators, we have privilege. We are directing in a clinical setting. We're directing or supporting students to ask questions of their patients. We're asking questions of our students. And it's important in those scenarios when we're working with people who may come from different backgrounds than our own, who may look different to us, to just stop for a moment, or to have an awareness that it might, using certain language or certain terms, might put them in a position that makes them feel uncomfortable, angry even, less than, and how to avoid overstepping the mark, how to avoid this, how to avoid straying into territory that we probably shouldn't stray into. So thinking again in a whole person way, a person-centered approach, which shouldn't just be reserved for our patients, but should be brought to mind when we're working with student groups or members of staff or colleagues.
A microaggression is a term used for commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental slights, whether intentional or intentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards stigmatized or culturally marginalized groups. So some examples are, for example, misogynist jokes, which might be, have been done historically and therefore may be considered as being something that is okay to be doing, but obviously that is going to make women, being othered and being treated differently from the others. Another example that is quite common potentially is repeatedly mispronouncing names because they are too hard to say it right, or to give someone a nickname because it's much more common in the UK to be using that name than the name of that person. Another example is, for example, using derogatory language describing disability. For example, it's mental, it's bonkers, where a psychological or a psychiatric disorder is used to describe someone. Another example is making homophobic comments like, "Oh, you don't look gay." And finally, an example, but this is far from being exhaustive, are racist comments like, "Oh, you work hard. You're quite different from other Black people I've worked with." Well, some of these examples might seem a bit too much and a bit pushed. These examples are, have been heard and have been said. So these things, if we are noticing them, it's also our duty to, respectfully and kindly help people using this language to notice that maybe the language they're using is not quite right, and also demonstrate to the people who are being stigmatized or being marginalized, to demonstrate that they have an ally and that this is not okay. And we talked about silent discrimination, not to become responsible for discrimination by our own silence.
So looking at some definitions once again. So this one, structural racism and discrimination. So this type of discrimination is at a large level, macro conditions, and they might be conditions about where people live, residential. It's about institutional policy, and there are things that limit people's opportunities. The resources are limited because of these policies or these discriminatory practices. People don't have equal power and equal opportunity to make the changes to their lives that would take them forward. They affect the well-being of individuals and populations, and these are things that are based on their race or their ethnicity. So we have examples where in clinical practice during the pandemic, some people were using pulse oximeters, and there have been instances there was a lack of awareness or lack of knowledge that the reading on a pulse oximeter for somebody with dark skin or black skin like mine, for example, the reading would not be accurate. It would be falsely elevated, which in the time of the pandemic, where we were acutely concerned about oxygen saturation levels, people in the black community knew, or some people in the black community knew, that this was the case. So if a pulse oximeter is produced and the patient is telling you, oh, so you realize that that might give an inaccurate reading, if that's glossed over, oh, it'll be fine, or it will roughly get an idea. And we have the awareness that there are more black people dying of COVID. This can be quite anxiety making, terrifying, upsetting for that patient, for that black patient. And so us beginning to understand those equalities, understand where policy, albeit not intentional, can have a negative effect, can create inequality, is very, very important. And so directing students to keep up to date, for us to keep up to date and be aware, is critical. We also know that there are, as we've discussed or about to discuss, gender pay gap. We know that we really need to bring our awareness of what's happening in the wider world around inequality, race and discrimination into the clinical setting, however uncomfortable it might be, because as I've said earlier, we can learn from this. It takes us forward. It makes the clinical encounter better. So looking at systemic racism, is a situation where you will have policies or practices in an organisation or in society that give unfair advantage to people based on their race, and this unfair advantage is continued or perpetuated and is obviously harmful because there is no equity there. So this has been looked at research-wise in the work indicated here, where what came through was that the experience that students of colour, black students, they were having a negative experience. They felt that they were marginalised or being laughed at or put in positions where they came out as the underdog, and that there was no awareness that this was happening, and so it just kept on happening, and it made for a very negative educational experience. So having an awareness of it, needing to see it, because once you become aware of it, you see it, you start to look for it, and then doing something about it in terms of policy, in terms of how we set up our educational system, how we set up our courses, how we set up our units, can make a huge difference and bring about equity. So I think there's one more here. We also know that the way in which this came out in midwifery, that black women were dying at higher rates than white women following childbirth or during childbirth, and a need to find out why that was happening, and that revealing that there were practices which were systemically racist, and a need to make change, because evidently that isn't something that, once known about, we can continue to allow to happen. So obviously that's quite an extreme example. We're not dealing with that in osteopathic education, but it illustrates the point.
Othering is the act of treating someone as though they are not part of a group and they are different in some way. And if you remember, during the focus group with the students from underrepresented groups, that was a term that they preferred from discrimination. So some examples might be, wow, your English is very good. Or, oh, look at this weather, I'm as dark as you are. And it's just demonstrating inherently that they are not like us. And whilst it might be okay to discuss about differences with someone that we know, where we have a strong relationship, and this is something that we can discuss and explore together, we have to start being aware of when it is okay to have that conversation. And starting a conversation with someone we have very little relationship just as yet, and talking about these differences is unlikely to lead to having making them feel welcome, included in the group.
So we're looking at centering here, and essentially centering it is a way that we're not listening. And often we're not listening, not because we're bad people or we're wanting to be harmful. It's often coming from discomfort. If somebody's sharing their experience, it can make us feel incredibly uncomfortable. So one of the ways of sort of slightly changing it is to derail the situation by starting to talk about ourselves. We center ourselves in the narrative that was started, and we start to say, oh, well, yes, I know exactly what you mean. That's exactly what happened to me. And then off we go. We're talking about ourselves. Or we're giving unsolicited advice or information, and it detracts from the person that was sharing their story, and that story may have been traumatic, it may have been harmful, and we have just brought it back to ourselves, taking the spotlight away from them, bringing it to ourselves, derailing the situation, maintaining privilege, maintaining our own comfort, and not really taking things forward for that individual. Although it may feel to us as if we have, what we've actually done is centered ourselves. So if we see that happening, or if we feel it coming on, because now you have a definition of it, an awareness of it, and that it can be any of us, that can help us to understand how that it isn't helpful, and it will often shut down communication, and that stops things improving or going forward. Whataboutism and distraction, where somebody intentionally seeks to derail, deflect, or respond to an accusation or a difficult question or a difficult scenario, or a report of a difficult scenario put before them, by making a counter accusation to steer the conversation away from the matter at heart. Or a matter of wrongdoing is brought to somebody, and a counter offence is brought forward to sort of just slide out the original accusation. So we sometimes see it in educational institutions. We see it sometimes in the staff room. We see it where one member of staff is bringing something to another member of staff, or a member of staff is bringing something they've observed amongst the student community to another member of staff who sweeps it away. Or we see students making complaints, or who are disgruntled because they feel that this has happened to them in the way they've been treated by an educator. And unless we deal with these situations, they don't go away, they just bubble away and get worse, and again can lead to lack of equity, discrimination, negative experience for staff or for students. So having an awareness of what it's all about, and having an awareness, allows us to start to see it and to start to tackle it. Ableism. So this could be described in some ways as a standardized thinking that we are all pretty much the same. We're all of a standard norm, and anyone who doesn't fit that standard norm has an impairment or a disability that should be eliminated, and then everything would be fine. So the belief that impairment or disability is inherently negative and should be eliminated. And that can be the ways in which we design our courses, the ways in which we design our learning material, our slide material, perhaps, our printed material, the way in which we expect all students to access information in the same way. It could be the font that we're using, it could be many different things. And it comes from this idea that everybody should be able in the same way, and if you're not, you're the problem, and that you need to change. And I think obviously in society we're beginning to see this, and we're beginning to change it in the same way that we're beginning to see and change it in our institutions. So certainly looking at the curriculum, looking at the ways in which we can work with people who have neurodivergence. And it's not limited to overt acts of discrimination. It can also be about our cultures and our practices which can exclude or be negative towards disabled people. So again, from an institutional point of view, working with the student body, just taking the time to stop and think about how we might improve things and how we might move away from, especially as people providing healthcare education, how we can move away from this idea of the standardized norm, which of course doesn't exist. So as we come to the end of this presentation, Jerry and I have made some suggestions for further reading and resources that you may find of interest. So on the previous slide, we allude to there's a link to the University College of Osteopathy website and the urgent research that we've undertaken, and also some slides and some videos from the forum that we held earlier this year. So urgent, the underrepresented groups in osteopathic education and training. So there's a link to that you might find helpful, and some suggestions to social media accounts that you might be interested in following if that's your thing. Can be really quite educational, and you don't have to engage with them actively, but it's quite interesting to read and see some of the things that people are saying as their lived experience, and things that can help the communities mentioned. So there are some trans accounts on there and some accounts for people who are advocating for change and support for certain groups. There are also some books mentioned here. The one at the end, which is a yoga book, I have found as a yoga teacher and osteopath very helpful in looking at the ways we can support people who are other abled, and particularly in terms of movement. So although it says yoga, it's a very accessible book about accessible yoga. And the reference at the top here is referring to a series done by the Lancet on racism, xenophobia and discrimination. So that might be of interest as well. Thank you very much for listening.